Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for our presentation, Cultural Experiences in Counselor Education, How I Maintain Personal and Professional Wellness. My name is Angélica Galván.
And I'm Kellie Forziat-Pytel. We're both doctoral candidates at the Pennsylvania State University. And Angie, I've got the chat open, so if anyone wants to chat with us, feel free to. We'll be asking some questions throughout. So thank you all for joining us. This presentation is based on a study that we did together to obtain a stronger understanding of the experiences of counselor educators and students in counseling programs, specifically how it relates to support and wellness. Some of our findings were showing that there's disconnects in programs being supportive of all cultures, despite our program and professional values. So in considering counselor educators and students, we wanted to know what they do when they're receiving both personal and professional messages related to culture, and then support strategies for their wellness in an effort to really destigmatize the experiences of minoritized individuals in counseling programs and the benefits that then this will bring to the clients that they're serving. So we'll try to connect all of that by looking at very specific cultural perspectives of the individuals that we talk to, their experiences, and then looking at wellness as a strategy.
Thank you, Kellie. So where did this interest begin? So we know that in counseling, diversity is emphasized. It's really important in everything that we do. We know that as the population in the United States continues to change, there's more push to include diversity in different areas. And the counseling profession has recognized that in order for it to be effective and competent, it needs to operate in the world that it is working with, the populations that it is working with. So with that in mind, different organizations have emphasized the importance of diversity. And so on here you can see American Counseling Association, the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies, and even accrediting boards. So for example, ACA definitely has addressed the inclusion of diversity in different aspects. And in particular, for our interest, section F11 talks about counselor education. It states that counselor educators are committed to recruiting and retaining diverse faculty, as well as recruiting and retaining diverse student body. With the implementation of the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, we also recognize that it's not just coming from the perspective of minoritized clients. We recognize that we all have different domains of privilege and oppression that we deal with, and it brings it to the forefront in how we work with clients, addressing those areas and how they might mingle. And finally, accrediting boards really emphasize this as well. For our example today, we're talking about KCREP, and KCREP addresses it in the same way that ACA does in the form of student body and faculty. So their statements are, and I quote, "The academic unit makes continuous and systematic efforts to attract, enroll, and retain a diverse group of students and to create and support an inclusive learning community." So in this one portion of the core values of KCREP, we see the word inclusion, something that we haven't seen in other areas as much. It's definitely emphasized. And it does so as well when we're talking about faculty members. The academic unit makes a continuous and systematic effort to recruit, employ, and retain a diverse faculty to create and support an inclusive learning community. So we definitely know that these things are very important. However, we don't have as much direction as to how to do that. And, some of that is definitely understandable. There is not one way that might fit all communities. It might not fit all institutions. But at the same time, not having any direction really puts the onus on programs to include these things. Um, so, we don't have that much research on diverse populations, but what we do know is that minoritized individuals are often burdened with educating others. If anyone has had these experience in courses where a lot of the minoritized students feel the need to share their experiences and educate their classmates on how they experience the world. This happens as well in faculty as well, when there's only a few that are able to speak for that. Because of this, there's a lot of tokenism and isolation within these populations, and we have a higher risk of dropout, and this is true for both students and faculty as well. However, we do have some positives in that regard, where minoritized faculty provide multiculturalism. They increase the diversity not only within programs, but institutions as well. And they serve as mentors for minoritized students. So there's definitely some research that shows the power of having more representation within programs. But we still need more research. There's not that much focus on minoritized counselors or counselors in training. There's more focus on minoritized clients and how to work with them. But we know that the destigmatization of minoritized individuals within our field will lead to destigmatization of clients that they serve because of that increase in representation.
We're also going to be talking about wellness quite a bit. So, what is wellness? Wellness is a very large focus in our counseling professional identity and philosophy. And wellness is a way of living for health and well-being. When this is the case, we're really looking at the mind, the body, and the spirit being connected at this optimal level for the individual. And counselors must strive for this and then also support their clients in achieving it. When counselors aren't learning to prioritize their well-being, the costs are really high for them, their clients, and then that counseling relationship as a whole. A number of issues could occur as well, and we could see that through burnout, compassion fatigue, countertransference. So counseling programs and counselor educators in them really have this goal of assisting graduate mental health counseling students to learn and engage in practices which maintain this wellness to prevent all of these negative consequences from occurring. And we'll look at that a little bit later in the scope of our research and how we're really looking at wellness as a potential retention strategy for both counseling students and counselor educators in counseling programs specifically. But the next slide that we have is a scenario for you. So feel free to either chime in or post to the chat, but we really want to know, what would you do for wellness? So I'll read the scenario and you can follow along with me. It's a Tuesday. Today you woke up tired after staying later than you normally would to finish an assignment that's due. Despite leaving your place on time, you were 10 minutes late to the counseling department because of an accident. Your first meeting was the most important one of the day and it ran over by 8 minutes. The rest of the day, you were 8 minutes late to everything else. When the day is finally over, what do you do? So we want to hear from you. What would you do for wellness?
What are some of those strategies that you already implement in your daily lives? We got a response. Yoga, go for a walk, talk to a friend, deep breathing.
Dance party. I
Dance
love
party.
that.
Sit. That's a good one. Just like take a breath.
Put my feet up. Go to sleep earlier. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea of a dance party. We should try something like that together.
Read a book for pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. Love
Yeah.
on my babies, alone time, nap.
Oh, that's a good idea. Can we have a dance party for the last 3 minutes of the session?
I
We'll
can try.
try. We will try.
Any dance movement therapy people on here? Oh, I ask a person in confidence to just listen for like 10 minutes as I rant. I can attest to that, as Kellie often is on the receiving ends of my words.
Yeah. But I mean, similar. You're my person to go to. So we were really interested in doing a study. Um, we were in a qualitative research class together. And so we applied a lot of what we were doing in that class to counselor education. So our study worked in two parts. First, we had a survey go out and we asked individuals to provide contact information if they were interested in a follow-up interview. As a whole of the study, we were really interested in looking at counselor educators and students' experiences in counseling programs related to the journey, which you can see there in the corner. It started with recruitment, and then we really wanted to know how that journey went and where it ended related to where they're situated now in their counseling programs, looking at key areas of inclusion, equity, retention, and then this little piece of wellness related to recruitment, like expectations with recruitment, their feelings of inclusion, and then where they're at, and if they were retained in said program. So recruitment, we're really interested in defining that for you. It's the process in which an organization finds and selects an applicant for a particular position. There's a lot of processes that go on with that. Screening, selecting, integrating the applicant into both the organization and the position. So in this one, we're really interested in looking at, in the study, the counseling program and then the university as a whole when we're recruiting and the messages that are being sent. For inclusion, we're looking at that in definition as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures, communities, reducing any exclusion within from education. And often that's our process of changing and modifying content, approaches, any structures, to make sure that they're considering all of these dimensions of our human lived experiences, which, for example, and this is by no means inclusive of all, but paying attention to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, class, gender, all of these things, bringing in that background and making sure that it's respected and accepted. Individuals are in these programs as a counselor educator or as a student, and their thoughts and feelings are welcome in this environment. And again, really understanding how they're feeling as a unique individual within their counseling program and then their university. So at those two different levels. And then retention, we're interested in seeing if the success or completion of a program for students, how are they feeling about being in their program? Have they switched programs? Are they thinking about switching programs? And then similar, counselor educators, how do they find themselves in the program that they're in? And are they feeling supported, or are there indicators that they could potentially leave? So wellness here, knowing that counselors strive to be both culturally sensitive and emphasize wellness and well-being, we wanted to understand wellness as a possible retention strategy in the journey in counseling.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. And I think an important thing to note too is how all of the comments about how you increase your own wellness are so diverse too that it's difficult to include all of them within a program. So we really wanted to know what kind of strategies were used within different programs and institutions. Um, so like Kelly mentioned, this was based off of a initial quantitative study where the results for the inclusion of the feelings of inclusion within programs and the acceptance of diversity were not significant. It was people were very happy with their programs. And the interesting fact that came out of the qualitative study was that that was not always the case. And it became clear what some of the issues were for students once we got to talk to them. So we conducted the study using phenomenology. We believe that qualitative inquiry can lead to a broader understanding and even more accurate picture of the experiences of our participants, especially when we're talking about inclusion within programs. So with that in mind, a phenomenological study we thought would be really helpful because it would help us understand the individual and collective internal experiences of a phenomenon and how participants intentionally and consciously think about their experiences. And it also has the added value of being able to hold contradicting ideas. And we thought that would be really helpful, especially since given the results from the quantitative study and thinking about how some people still continue to struggle with inclusion, it would really hold those two truths and help us understand a better picture. So we conducted interviews that were 45 to 60 minutes long. And just to give a short picture, some of the questions that we asked were about identity, what major components of identity they held dear, their journey to becoming a counselor. And then when it came to wellness, we'll talk about those questions in a little bit. This study had 7 participants. We had 5 who identified as female, 2 who identified as male, and within those, 1 was a counselor educator, 4 were doctoral students, and 2 were master's level students. They self-identified, and some of the minoritized identities that came out within this population, or this sample, excuse me, were for race and ethnicity, parenthood, first generation college student, military spouse, political and religious status as well. So those were the self-identified identities that they chose to talk about that were significant to their experiences.
And if I could just add, Angie,
Please.
because this was a part 1 and part 2, this is all of our results as of now. But given the sample that we have, as you can see, you know, it is really heavy on students. So we're providing this information now and some of the findings so far, but also just to know this is by no means, you know, a group in which we can really generalize or say that we're complete in terms of saturation. So we will still be doing some qualitative research after this, but this is all of what we found up to this point.
Thank you.
Oops, did I skip a slide, Angie? Or not?
Oh, well, we are missing a slide. We wanted to talk briefly about the results that came up with inclusion, because that really connects with those feelings, with wellness within programs, the feelings of belonging. So just to share with you all quickly some of the themes that came up within inclusion section of our qualitative interview. We had 4 major themes. One of them was having others that they identify with. was a major component of inclusion. Again, thinking back to what we know about diversity within programs and those feelings of isolation and tokenism, this really played on that and how important it was to have others that they can rely on. One example that comes to mind is about communication style, and knowing how diverse cultures have different communication styles. One in particular, one of our participants talked about how her communication style was seen as mean because she has a very direct communication style. So she had to connect with other members in her program who were also more diverse to be able to feel that she could communicate clearly without being misunderstood, because they had similar communication styles. So for her, having others that she identified with was really important. Other things that came out from this theme were having faculty rely on these students to be the ones to speak up. So if it's just one student, they really have the burden of that responsibility versus having others to share it with. Sometimes because they don't have others that they identify with, they feel they have to advocate for themselves because programs don't understand some of the things that they are going through. Which leads to the second theme, awareness of student struggles. This one was really clear for minoritized students when it came to ethnicity and race, and for parenthood, thinking that a lot of the times their roles in the home were not taken into consideration, and having to choose between activities to participate in when they were outside of the classroom. Another theme was a sense of community, really feeling that a lot of the responsibility was on them to create a sense of community. For those that did have a strong sense of community, it was often within their programs. It was often due to organizations such as CSI that created that sense of community by having dance parties, for example, or or events that are outside of the program. And then finally, acceptance of what people bring into the program. So one in particular, one of our participants, when discussing their religious beliefs, talked about the feelings of not feeling included, because although our profession is accepting of different views, there's a majority of liberal views that are had by individuals within programs. And so this participant talked about the feeling of walking on eggshells when around others within the program, because they couldn't represent their full views without feeling judged. So those are some of the themes that came up with inclusion within our study.
Thank you, Angie. And when I was sharing, I shared the wrong one. So now we're good. So when we were looking at our specific support and wellness questions, these were looking at our semi-structured questioning. These were the big questions that we asked, and then of course we prompted as needed. But how does your program support you in your work? How does your program support your wellness? And then how can your program improve in this area? So we just really left them as open as they possibly could be at the very beginning. And then we added some sub-questions as we went, really looking at, inclusion in some cases, lack thereof. We wanted to know their perspective relative to wellness. So looking at the first question.
How does your program support you and your work? Some of the themes that came from this particular question were boundaries. Definitely feeling that there were clear boundaries that they could set within their program. So one of the quotes that really emphasized that was encourage boundaries around how much I'm here, how much I'm I'm taking on, how much time I'm spending on things. They ask those kinds of questions. So boundaries really made a clear statement for individuals that their wellness was being taken into account, that they were being supported. There was another example of a student saying that faculty took no well, that she felt she was able to take on what she was able to, while feeling confident that if she couldn't and she would say no to particular tasks or events, it would be okay. One example she gave was of conferences, especially with the struggles for financial support within her institution. So when pressed as to why she wasn't presenting or going to conferences, it was accepted when she said no due to financial stress or other factors such as family. So those kinds of things really spoke to students and to faculty, to the one faculty member that we have so far, about their interests being taken into consideration within their programs. Another theme that came up was experiences, and we saw this in both sharing of resources and providing practice for individuals. So sharing of resources again came up as experiences, and also sort of the sense of community of being able to share the wealth. So we have another quote that kind of symbolizes that. So they sent that information out, resources. I think they take no very well. Yeah, that's the other example that I shared earlier about being able to provide those opportunities for students, and knowing that it would be okay if they wouldn't be able to do so. And then our final theme that came up with support within programs is understanding needs. A lot of the participants shared about support that they found within their programs, both verbal and emotional. So being able to share those experiences with others was how they found support within their programs. The last quote that we have on the screen for you kind of goes along those lines. We have spoken about well-being and how important it is for us as future counselors to have that sense of well-being before we can even really counsel others. So that is very much part of the first class. We were talking about well-being, and it's very evident that they do share and worry about us being healthy mentally and physically. So like programs really putting in that effort to demonstrate to students that it's important.
So we wanted to really know the indivisible self model. And so we know that this is based on psychological theory and practice, and that this model was actually founded over 25 years of research in the field of wellness. And the model shows that not only are the body, mind, and spirit integrated, but they're fundamentally inseparable. So when we're looking at understanding wellness and understanding these people that we're talking to, we have to look at the person as a whole. And these 5 factors here that you can see of wellness, the creative self, coping self, social self, essential self, and the physical self, these are all making up that whole self, or the indivisible self. And so each of the selves hold these additional sub-factors that are contributing to wellness in the self and total wellness. So the creative self, you can see there around it. It's comprised of these attributes that each of us form to have this unique place among others in our social interactions. There's a coping self, how we regulate our responses to life events, and provides meanings for surpassing the negative things that happen in our life. Then there's a social self, how relationships are enhancing the quality of life. The essential self, the sense of meaning and purpose in one's life, and then the physical self. So how are we taking care of our body, and how is it affected by the choices that we make, such as nutrition. So we really wanted to understand in the next question, do our participants, like, are they aware of this model? Are they using it? And thinking of it this way, how is the program supporting their wellness? And this is what we found.
So thinking about the indivisible model, how does your program support your wellness? And so our theme for this was practice what you preach. So there were some messages of how programs do support wellness and some confusion at the same time. So some of the, I'll share a couple of quotes. One of our participants said, "Each class I've taken so far has a connection to these things. It's covered in the reading somehow." In like every section is one of the quotes. But then another participant, "Oh, I don't really know. It's my responsibility. It's not so much the program that doesn't say like, hey, you," oh, sorry, I'm getting confused. I mean, they do say you should take care of yourself. So again, it's the message that's coming across, and not always being as evident in the actions. And so some of the things that popped out from this particular question within all the participants, that the programs support my work. They have visual reminders. They have the philosophy of mentors and department heads that show that it matters, but it's usually the individual's responsibility. So that's one of the things that really came up within these answers, that it was present, but it wasn't always executed, and it was up to each individual to find a way of incorporating this more and more. Another example that came from this question was how the program was supportive to their students by listening to them. And it was in this particular program where they had a lot of the big assignments due at the same time, and that the students got together to discuss this with faculty members to ask if there could be some kind of adjustment to the schedule so that not all the major assignments were due at the same time. So thinking about how the program is even structured was important. And the program responded to that and made adjustments, but it was not in their awareness that this could potentially be an issue when they have a cohort system. So those kinds of things, of it being present and maybe not always conducted in a beneficial way for students. And you can see other examples of how students and faculty, the one faculty member saw this being represented within their programs to, programs being able to offer free counseling service, acknowledgement and support for the needs of balance or a break, understanding the intensity of a program after students are able to vocalize that, allowing food in class. So definitely it's there. It's not always very activity based or as present.
So our questioning got a lot more specific in that we wondered about support, we wondered about wellness. We asked very specifically about these different domains of wellness. And then after having them reflect and give or recall some ideas that were just shared, we then asked the question, how can your program improve in this area? Which was interesting because you can see there, they were saying, well, faculty can only do so much. It falls on the individual. Faculty can just ensure these good professional boundaries, and that may be in the form of professional workflow to their students. Or like if they work with these students as a GA, that's another way they can sort of monitor how much work they're giving and timelines and such. Another person said, it doesn't feel like anyone's trying to integrate too much. So they looked at that as both a strength, but then also a weakness. So they were saying, like, I think it's really integrated and woven, but I don't know that they're actually really teaching it. And so for this individual, they were struggling because they saw that maybe their program was doing stuff, but they weren't necessarily naming it. And then there was someone else who was saying, it's the students that bring it in the classroom. So faculty are being very supportive of students bringing it in, but that would also mean that if students aren't bringing it in, then where is it in terms of the program?
So limitations, there's definitely some limitations to this study. I think although 7 participants is acceptable for a phenomenological study, it's hard to know if it's really representative of counselors in training and counselor educators, specifically because of our numbers. So we are hoping to be able to expand on that.
And to add to that, Angie, just looking at some of the differences that we were able to see between expectations for inclusion and wellness in an online program versus a face-to-face, given the demographics that a lot of these participants shared when we're saying we're not really sure if it's representative, it's because of these really unique pieces that we really should have maybe 7 more individuals able to speak to the online presence and what wellness looks like there in comparison to face to face. So that was just something that I thought that was really interesting, that we were finding differences in expectations just across our variables when we were looking at the differences across programs, K-CREP versus non-K-CREP accredited, online versus face-to-face. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And just their expectations of their program, knowing that it's face-to-face versus online, is very different. So yeah, a bigger sample of those types of students would be way more beneficial to understanding where they're coming from. So some of the limitations, in addition to generalizability, which we all know that that's not always the aim of qualitative studies. It's more of understanding the individual experiences. However, we do realize that this was a smaller piece of the bigger project, and that could lead to additional limitations within our study. The way that we wanted to incorporate questions that really got to recruitment, inclusion, and retention meant that some of our questions, especially as wellness were towards retention, a section of our interview, we had already received a lot of information from our participants, and so sometimes they had already answered part of that question, so they sort of ran together. We weren't always very consistent as to ask them the 3 questions completely separate. Sometimes they were combined a bit. I think that the use of the wellness model, what we talked about it as a whole. I think that if we were to separate it into the different components and ask questions specific to each one, our data would be very, very different. So we do recognize that this could be an interview all by itself instead of including recruitment and inclusion within that same framework. And sometimes some students didn't know the model as well. They were familiar with parts of it, but not all of them. Sometimes some of the components were a bit confusing. It's not always as clear as some sections are. For example, the physical may be clearer than the essential self, for example. So having to quickly explain that to participants took time as well. And we can't always assure that they're fully understanding what we're explaining to them so that they can talk about their experiences with that specific section of the model. So we do know that that leads to ideas of how to correct that in future studies. So our sample is definitely not fully representative of the population. As Kelly talked about, we had not only did we have one counselor educator, some doctoral students, and some master students, we also had some students that complete their program online versus brick and mortar. So there's definitely a lot of adjustments to make there. The self-identifying factors that they shared about minoritized status were varied. And so we think also that if we were to separate that and maybe do a study with individuals who are racially and ethnically minoritized would lead to conclusions versus maybe another study with a sample that were all military spouse would have different conclusions versus religious beliefs. Having them all together definitely shines a light of what it's like for minoritized students, but it might be different if we were to group them in separately. Potential research bias. I think that Kelly and I have a unique perspective as we are very different in many aspects, and we're able to help each other out and seeing maybe how our own biases might come into play. But like any time that we are conducting qualitative research, there's still a possibility that there will be some researcher bias. We took steps to attempt to prevent that as much as we could, but I don't think that's ever something that you can fully prevent. And so there's always potential for that. And then finally, as Kelly mentioned earlier, we're hoping to continue to gather data and maybe really beef up our sample size.
But I think what we're finding so far with regards to support strategies for wellness is really interesting. I mean, it says a lot that people aren't aware of this pretty famous, what I would say, indivisible self wellness model. And that it's evolved with 25 years of research. So people are doing research on wellness, but there's bits and pieces of it that students are more familiar with. But some of the things that we've been able to uncover in terms of support strategies for those of you who are counselor educators or even students, looking for more wellness, you can have conversations with faculty about some of these key areas. So helping to maintain appropriate work-life boundaries, so more of that awareness. One of our students was really talking about how faculty members really forget that for students, there's only these little pockets of time where they can eat or they can exercise. And by having these really strict standards for dressing for class, that means that student wouldn't be able to get in a little jog in between classes. So being aware of work-life boundaries in the context of a counselor educator program and how intensive some of those are. Also being able to, through appearance and modeling, good wellness behavior. So having faculty members who are well and they're encouraging wellness, and they can see through examples or through class activities that wellness is a really important component for the self and the therapeutic relationship. Also, the acknowledgement of stress and understanding personally and professionally. So helping students, that awareness and recognition that there's a lot going on in personal lives. And I think a lot of us who are teaching now are being mindful of that because of COVID-19 and that huge weight that students are experiencing in the personal life that is creating a lot of difficulties for students in the professional realm. So being mindful of that student who maybe it's not this global crisis, but maybe there's a student that just lost their job and there's financial struggles. Also realizing the time in the semester. So slowing down around holidays, or, I didn't even think about it, but everything is due around midterm and at the end of the semester, but being mindful of the other classes that students are taking and the due dates for major assignments would be a really good thing for a department to sit down and say, okay, this is my biggest research project and this is when it's due. When are other things due? And maybe we can make them different weeks to help sort of negotiate more of a work-life balance. And then by incorporating it into coursework and clinical work, really naming it like we are doing this for wellness, rather than saying it's interwoven in our mission or in our concentrations, and therefore we don't really have to do more with that in terms of program building and decision making. So this is really depending on where you're coming from, and feel free to speak up if there's anything that you guys want to share that you do specific to wellness and programs. We'd love to hear it. These were just some of the really creative themes or support strategies that we were able to identify to sort of give you guys at this point. But we know that there's probably a lot of you out there with other things that you're doing, so we would love to hear them. And it looks like someone asked the question, did you look at this in relation to online programs with term-based or accelerated models? I wonder what this would look like. So that's something that we did note. We looked, when we're looking at that online versus face-to-face or brick and mortar, some of them did have the quarter, were they saying quarters? And they were also the one that was mentioning slowing down around the holidays. So for them, it was like they had this one class and it was already super intensive, but then it was also around the holidays. So they felt like if in those classes there were anything that they could do for students, but being more mindful of that because of how short their programs were. But that's a really good comment and something that I think with more participants we would be more mindful of. But we only had one student that talked about quarters.
And I think too, it was a learning experience for, at least for me. I wasn't as aware of the structure of online programs. Another comment, a department being on the same page with due dates is huge in my experience. And yeah, I think it's hard, especially because, there's end of term assignments, and you want to give students as much time to complete those large assignments. And I'm thinking specifically on doctoral programs and how, well, we really want to prepare students for what it will be like once they're faculty, and how you'll always have a lot of things on your plate. Is also something to take into account. But if we really want to infuse wellness, it's something to consider when planning maybe the order of classes for cohort models or the assignments that are going to be due, and maybe finding a way of separating them somehow to be able to support that for students.
Yeah, and I think, Angie, you mentioned doc students and the different levels. In my own experience, I think it's easier to know what your doc students are taking. But then when you're at the master's level and there's a lot of electives and options, or depending on the size of the program, there could be a lot of adjunct faculty members or part-time instructors who may be more involved in the department and programmatic decisions than others. So where you're at, it's just something to think about. If you haven't done that already, it does sound like departments are being mindful of that, which is great. Any other comments from the group? Well, we want to make sure we leave time for our dance party, so we've got one more slide on future directions. And Also feel free to jump in as well if you see anything. This is just sort of where we're going based on our initial goals for the project.
Yeah, and we did, we've been mentioning these things as we've gone through the presentation of future directions and within our limitations as well. So hoping to be able to expand this a bit further, understanding that as we talk about diversity and how diversity is increasing, we want to make sure that the diverse population within our programs are being supported, not only for their own well-being, but for the well-being of clients as well, as we're trying to increase the use of counseling services across the board in different communities. So I think that I think we both agree that working to support diverse students and the destigmatization of these individuals within programs would really help and support diverse clients that might need services and might feel more comfortable connecting with those that they can identify with. We know from the literature that that is often the case when it comes to those visual identifiers or language. So hopefully this can increase those benefits for the profession as a whole.
So some of you wanted a dance party. Does anyone have a song request? Or you can just all, sort of get up and move. It's been a long day. A lot of you have been sitting on the computer all day for a virtual conference. So if anyone wants to even lead us in dance or have a suggestion, I can pull a dance up. We do have about, I'd say, like 7 minutes, because then we can give the next presenter some time to get set.
Unless are there any questions on our content?
If I just type in dance.
So someone requested Journey.
Journey.
Do we want Don't Stop Believing? Is that the danciest Journey song? But I hope that you guys will share your camera and dance with us.
Don't Stop Believing. All right, here we go, guys. Oh wait, that's not.
I like your slide. Oh, somebody has it ready.
Someone has it ready.
Elizabeth, go ahead. Share your microphone. And
yes, please do.
Oh, I assumed it was daughter. It says 5-year-old.
5-year-old son. Here you go.
I'm sorry.
I'm ready. We're ready.
There's
guys finishing up.
There's a commercial.
On the roof.
There.
Kellie, do you want to stop sharing so we can